before we blast off, say hi in the comments. It may seem small, but it helps the algorithm beam this out to more sci-fi fans. And I seriously love seeing who's part of the crew.
The Dominion capital of Val Prime glittered like a poisoned jewel against the void of space, its once magnificent orbital defense platforms now shattered husks, their broken remnants orbiting like the skeletal remains of fallen titans. The planetary shield generators, technological marvels that had once repelled the mightiest armadas in the galaxy, flickered with dying light, their energy matrices collapsing under the systematic assault of humanity's vengeance. After a year of brutal conflict that had painted the stars with blood and fire, the once mighty Dominion had been reduced to its core systems, its fleets atomized, its colonies either conquered or abandoned to the endless dark. Through the viewports of the command deck aboard the Prometheus, Admiral Jack Harper watched the doomed world with eyes that had witnessed too much death to find satisfaction in this final victory. The neural interfaces at his temples pulsed with the collective consciousness of his fleet, every ship, every weapon, every soldier, an extension of humanity's unified will. And yet, beneath the cold certainty of their mission, something unexpected had begun to stir in the shared consciousness: doubt. "Final approach vector calculated," reported Lieutenant Lin, her voice carrying the artificial harmonics of someone who had replaced their vocal cords with quantum resonators for perfect communication precision. "Planetary defense grid at 12% capacity, and full estimate complete shield failure in 17 minutes, 14 seconds. Harper acknowledged with the barest nod, feeling the weight of history's judgment pressing down upon his augmented frame. His neural feeds displayed the tactical situation with perfect clarity. Humanity stood on the precipice of complete victory. The species that had nearly exterminated them 3 centuries ago now faced the same fate they had dealt so callously to Earth and its colonies. "The dead are watching," whispered Commander Xavier, standing at Harper's side. Unlike most of the crew, Xavier had chosen to maintain some semblance of his original appearance despite extensive internal modifications. The choice was deliberate, a reminder of what humanity had once been before necessity transformed them into something else entirely. "I can feel them in the network. 300 years of waiting, and finally, they will have justice." Harper closed his eyes, accessing the deeper layers of the neural network where the memory echoes of the dead resided, the preserved consciousness fragments of those who had perished in the original genocide. Their presence had guided humanity's evolution, their suffering the forge upon which a new species had been hammered into existence. Their hunger for retribution had been the fuel that powered humanity's return from the edge of oblivion. But now, on the cusp of their final vengeance, their voices were no longer unified. Some still cried out for blood, for the complete eradication of the species that had tried to erase them from existence. Others, however, had begun to question whether annihilation would truly bring the peace they had sought for centuries. "Prepare the landing craft," Harper ordered, his decision made. "I will lead the ground assault personally." Supreme Chancellor Lurath Vakos IV stood in the ancient Hall of Ascension, its vaulted ceiling bearing the weight of 1,000 years of imperial history. Holographic murals depicting the rise of the Dominion flickered and distorted as power fluctuations rippled through the palace complex. Around him stood the shattered remnants of the High Council and the grim-faced commanders of what remained of his military beings who had once commanded the destiny of billions now reduced to trembling shadows awaiting execution. Before them, a holographic projection displayed the approaching human armada, a force unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The ships moved not as individual vessels, but as a single organism, their formations shifting with impossible precision. Energy readings defied conventional physics, suggesting modifications to reality itself that the Dominion scientists had theorized, but never dared implement. "The planetary annihilation protocol is our only remaining option," General Theros insisted, his voice cracking with desperation. Blood leaked from his ceremonial armor where shrapnel from the last orbital bombardment had pierced his chest. Medical nanites fought a losing battle to keep him conscious. "We detonate the planetary core, take as many of them with us as possible. At least we die with honor instead of facing whatever horrors they've devised for us." The proposal sparked immediate debate, with some councillors arguing passionately for the measure, while others recoiled at the thought of killing the billions of civilians still sheltering in the planet's vast underground complexes. The argument grew heated, threatening to dissolve into physical violence, a final pathetic mirror of the Empire's collapse. Vakos stood silent amid the chaos, his gaze fixed on the ancient ceremonial blade that had been passed down through his family for generations. The crystalline edge still held its molecular perfection, able to slice through any known material with ease. For a millennium, it had symbolized the unbroken line of Dominion leadership. Now, it represented nothing but failure and the end of everything his ancestors had built. With trembling hands that betrayed both fear and resolution, he unsheathed the weapon. The distinctive sound, a high, clear note like crystal striking crystal, silenced the chamber instantly. Every eye turned to their leader as he laid the blade deliberately on the marble council table, its edge catching the dying light of their civilization. "We brought this upon ourselves," he said, finally, his voice carrying the weight of terrible understanding. The ceremonial intonations of imperial speech had fallen away, leaving only the raw honesty of a being facing extinction. Our ancestors feared humanity's potential so greatly that they attempted to erase them from existence. And in doing so, they created exactly what they feared most. Not just an enemy, but a nemesis born of our own arrogance. The silence that followed was heavy with the recognition of truth too long denied. The Dominion's historical archives had been systematically purged of all references to humanity centuries ago, not just as a matter of policy, but as a desperate attempt to forget the one species that had ever truly threatened them. Yet in that forgetting they had sown the seeds of their own destruction. Before any could respond to this final confession, the chamber's security systems failed simultaneously, their status indicators blinking out like dying stars. The neural encrypted locks on the massive ornate doors designed to withstand any known form of intrusion disengaged with a synchronized series of clicks that echoed ominously through the vast chamber. The doors slid open to reveal Admiral Jack Harper, flanked by Commander Xavier and a squad of human soldiers. How they had penetrated the heart of the most secure facility in the Dominion without triggering a single alarm was a testament to how far humanity had evolved beyond their former limitations. Their presence here at the very center of Dominion power rendered all discussions of resistance or self-destruction meaningless. The human soldiers moved with the fluid grace of beings who had transcended the limitations of flesh. Their exoskeletons pulsed with energy patterns that distorted visual perception, making them appear simultaneously solid and ghost-like. Neural interfaces glinted at their temples, connecting them to a shared consciousness that allowed them to function as a single entity with multiple bodies. Most terrifying was the absolute silence of their advance. No orders were given, no communications detectable. They simply moved as one organism, securing the chamber with ruthless efficiency while never taking their augmented eyes off the Dominion leadership. "Supreme Chancellor Vakos III," Harper announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous chamber with unnatural resonance, "you stand accused of inheriting and perpetuating a regime built upon the genocide of humanity. What say you before judgment is passed?" The question hung in the air, weighted with 3 centuries of suffering and the culmination of humanity's long exile. In that moment, the entire chamber held its breath, waiting to witness the final act of a tragedy, centuries in the making. Vakos stepped forward, the ceremonial robes of his office, garments that had once inspired awe and terror across hundreds of worlds, suddenly feeling like an absurd costume, a child's dress-up game in the face of real power. The genetic markers on his face, proudly denoting his direct descent from the architect of humanity's near extinction, seemed to burn with shame. "I cannot undo the crimes of my ancestors, Admiral Harper," he said, his multi-toned voice stripped of imperial harmonics. "But I can face the consequences with the dignity that befits the final leader of the Dominion." To the shock of his advisors and the visible surprise of the human soldiers, Vakos sank to his knees before the human commander. The act, unprecedented in the 1,000-year history of the Empire, sent ripples of disbelief through the chamber. No Dominion ruler had ever knelt before another species. It was more than submission. It was the symbolic end of everything the Empire had represented. "I offer my life in exchange for my people," Vakos continued, raising his face to meet Harper's gaze directly. "They are not responsible for decisions made centuries before their birth. If blood is required to balance the scales of justice, let it be mine alone." A murmur ran through the human soldiers, their neural interfaces transmitting the unexpected development to the entire fleet in orbit. The collective consciousness rippled with confusion, with uncertainty. For the first time since their return from exile, the burning certainty of their mission faltered. The algorithmic calculations of vengeance that had driven them across the stars suddenly confronted a variable they had not anticipated: mercy from the enemy they had been engineered to destroy. Harper approached the kneeling Chancellor, his augmented eyes studying the alien with an intensity that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to judge the very soul beneath. The neural interfaces at his temples pulsed with increasing speed as the collective consciousness of humanity grappled with this moment, a fork in the path of their destiny. "Do you know why your ancestor feared humanity so greatly, Chancellor?" Harper asked, his voice softening to something almost recognizably human. "It wasn't our capacity for violence. Your species has demonstrated that quality in abundance. It was our capacity for change, for adaptation, for transformation. He feared we would evolve beyond the constraints that bind all other species to their nature." He unsheathed his own blade, not a ceremonial symbol but a weapon that had tasted the blood of countless Dominion soldiers across 100 battlefields. The edge glowed with energy fields capable of slicing through the strongest armor, the hilt inscribed with the names of human worlds reduced to ash by Dominion weapons. He was right to fear us, but he was wrong about why. In a motion too swift for unaugmented eyes to follow, Harper brought the blade down, not upon the Chancellor's neck as every being in the chamber expected, but into the marble floor before him. The impact drove the blade deep into the ancient stone, creating a spiderweb of cracks that radiated outward across the chamber like a physical manifestation of the Imperial collapse. "The true test of evolution isn't the capacity to destroy," Harper said, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber and, through the neural network, to every human throughout the fleet. "It's the capacity to break cycles of violence when vengeance stands within reach." Commander Xavier stepped forward, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. The neural implants at his temples flashed with crimson warning indicators as his individual consciousness threatened to break from the collective in protest. "Admiral, they burned our worlds," he shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "They slaughtered billions. They hunted our ancestors like animals." "Justice demands justice," Harper interrupted. "Not genocide. We didn't come this far, transform ourselves this completely, only to become what we have hated for centuries." The words hung in the air, a challenge to the very foundation upon which humanity had rebuilt itself. For 300 years they had defined themselves by this quest, engineered their bodies and minds for this single purpose. To turn aside now at the moment of absolute victory was to question everything they had become. Harper turned back to Vel'Koz, who remained kneeling, confusion evident in his alien features. "Your ancestor erased us from history because he feared what we might become. Today you will witness exactly what humanity has become." What followed was not the expected slaughter, but something far more profound. The next hours unfolded in a ceremony, unlike any the galaxy had witnessed, not a massacre, but a reckoning of unprecedented nature. The Dominion's High Command was systematically tried for their roles in the current conflict. Those who had ordered atrocities against human forces or Dominion civilians who had shown sympathy to the human cause were executed, not in vengeance but in somber justice. Others were sentenced to labor, rebuilding worlds that had been devastated in the war that had consumed the galaxy. Most striking was the fate of Chancellor Vel'Koz himself. He was sentenced not to death, but to life, specifically, to bearing witness. Through human neural technology, he was connected to the collective memory archive. For 3 days, he experienced firsthand the memories of Earth's destruction, felt the terror of children as their worlds burned, endured the centuries of exile and transformation that had forged humanity into what they had become. He witnessed not just the suffering but the resilience, the moments of love and courage that had sustained the survivors in their darkest hours. He experienced the agonizing choices that had led humans to sacrifice their original form in pursuit of justice, the loss of identity that came with each modification, each step away from what they had once been. When he emerged from the experience days later, Vel'Koz was a changed being, his eyes holding the same haunted quality that every human carried. The genetic markers on his face, once proud symbols of his lineage, had faded, as if his very DNA had recoiled from the legacy they represented. "Now you understand," Harper said simply. "Now you remember what your kind chose to forget." The dissolution of the Dominion was formally declared on the steps of the Imperial Palace. broadcast across every world and outpost that had once been under its control. Admiral Harper stood not as a conqueror, but as an arbiter of a new reality, his augmented form gleaming in the light of Valhalla Prime's setting sun. For 3 centuries, humanity prepared for this moment, driven by memories of fire and ash, he announced to the assembled representatives of 100 species that had lived under Dominion rule. We return not to establish a new empire, but to ensure that no species ever again faces what we faced. The cycle ends here, not with extinction, but with memory. The revelation that humanity would not assume control of the fallen empire sent shockwaves through the gathered assembly. Most had expected simply a change of masters, the replacement of one tyranny with another. Instead, Harper outlined a framework for self-governance that would allow each world to determine its own fate. More shocking was the announcement that humanity would initiate a process of de-evolution, a systematic reversal of the modifications that had transformed them into living weapons. Having achieved justice, they would now attempt the most difficult transformation of all, a return to something closer to what they had once been. The human fleet, having accomplished their mission of justice, prepared to depart, but they left behind representatives on every world, tasked not with governance but with remembrance, living archives ensuring that the true history would never again be erased. The memory of what had happened to humanity and what had nearly happened to the Dominion would serve as an eternal warning against the hubris of any species that believed itself entitled to determine which civilizations deserved to exist. On the final day of the occupation, Admiral Harper stood alone with Vakos in the Hall of Ascension, now stripped of its imperial regalia. The humans' neural interfaces had already begun the process of detachment, the first step in the long journey back toward a more recognizable humanity. "What will you become now?" Vakos asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. The experience of the shared memories had fundamentally altered him, creating something neither fully Dominion nor human, but a bridge between species bound by shared understanding. "Your people have defined themselves by this quest for centuries. What defines humanity when vengeance is no longer your purpose?" Harper smiled, a genuine expression that few had seen during the brutal campaign, a flash of the original human beneath the modifications. "That, Chancellor, is the question every species must answer for itself. The pursuit of justice brought us back from the edge of extinction. The rejection of genocide when it stood within our grasp gives us the right to find a new answer." He reached up and, with a deliberate motion, detached one of the neural interfaces from his temple. Blood welled from the connection point. Real, red, human blood untouched by the modifications that had sustained him through the campaign. "Perhaps we will become what we might have been if your ancestors had not feared us so greatly," he said, examining the detached technology in his palm. "Or perhaps something entirely new. The true victory isn't in destroying an enemy, but in reclaiming the freedom to choose our own evolution." As the human fleet departed Dominion space, they left not a power vacuum but a carefully orchestrated transition to self-governance for each world. They carried with them the data crystals containing the true history of both humanity and the Dominion, ensuring that the lessons of both would endure. But they also carried something unexpected, something that had emerged only in the final moments of their long crusade: hope. The modifications that had allowed them to survive exile and achieve vengeance had also nearly cost them their essential humanity. In choosing justice over genocide at the moment of triumph, they had discovered a path back to themselves. Among the stars that had once witnessed humanity's near extinction, now spread a new legend of a species that had transformed suffering into strength, vengeance into justice, and in their moment of absolute power chose to break the cycle that had defined their existence. They had returned not as conquerors but as harbingers of a truth the galaxy had tried to forget, that the greatest power lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the choice to create something new from the ashes of the past. The most profound revelation was not in the victory they had achieved, but in what they chose to do with it. By rejecting the final annihilation of their enemy, humanity had achieved a triumph more complete than vengeance could ever provide. They had reclaimed their soul. The stars, which had once been silent witnesses to humanity's suffering, now held the promise of a transformed future, one forged in the crucible of unspeakable loss, but tempered by the most profound evolution of all, the capacity to choose a path beyond vengeance when standing at the precipice of retribution. In this final choice lay humanity's true victory, not over the Dominion, but over the darkness within themselves that centuries of suffering had nurtured. In sparing their enemy, they had saved them. Supreme Chancellor Lorath, Vakos I, trembled violently as he watched the holographic display of yet another Dominion fleet vanishing in brilliant flashes of light against the human onslaught. The six-fingered hands that had once confidently guided an empire now shook uncontrollably, his third eye twitching beneath its ceremonial seal, a physical manifestation of terror no Dominion ruler had experienced in a millennium of uncontested power. 6 months into what his advisors had initially dismissed as a minor border incursion, the Dominion of Raal was hemorrhaging territory, resources and lives at a rate that defied comprehension. The military reports had grown increasingly desperate, then incoherent, and now were often nothing more than final transmissions cut short by death screams. Entire worlds, once proud colony planets with billions of inhabitants, had gone silent after sending distress signals describing human vessels materializing without warning in their skies. "How?" he demanded, slamming his fist against the ancient marble table that had supported the weight of 4 generations of his bloodline. The impact fractured the stone along fault lines invisible moments before, a physical mirror of the cracks spreading through his empire. Blood trickled between his knuckles, ignored. How do they anticipate our outer move? How do their ships move as they do? We commanded the greatest fleet in the galaxy's history. From the shadows surrounding the central command base, an aide approached with a medical injector. Vikos slapped it away with such force that the device shattered against the obsidian wall, the stimulant spattering across priceless historical murals depicting Dominion conquest. None dared approach him again. High Admiral Kresh stood at attention, his face ashen under the ceremonial markings of his rank. Once resplendent in gold-threaded regalia that had struck fear into subject species across hundreds of systems, he now wore the haunted expression of a being who had witnessed the unthinkable. The right side of his face bore fresh burn scars from a barely survived encounter with human forces at Proxima Delta, his proud ancestry markings now twisted into a grotesque parody. "Chancellor," Kresh began, his voice cracking, "we've recovered data from the wreckage of their ships." He paused, visibly struggling to continue. Flecks of blood appeared at the corners of his mouth, internal injuries from his last battle, still untreated as medical resources were stretched beyond breaking. "Their neural interfaces," he hesitated, swallowing hard, a wet rattle emanating from his damaged lungs. "Their pilots are physically connected to their vessels. They don't command their ships. They become their..." The holographic display shifted to autopsy footage of a recovered human pilot where the torso should have connected to the pilot's seat. There was instead a grotesque fusion of flesh and technology. Neural fibers intertwined with ship systems, circulatory connections feeding directly into engine cooling systems. The recording showed the pilot's brain still firing neural patterns matching ship maneuvers minutes after clinical death. Vakos felt nausea rising in his throat, the ceremonial meal he had forced himself to consume earlier threatening to reappear. He swallowed it back, the bitter taste of bile mingling with the metallic flavor of fear. "Abomination," he whispered, his multi-toned voice harmonics failing for the first time in his public life. "That's not all, my lord." Kresh's voice faltered further as he gestured to the projection controls. The image shifted to battlefield recordings from Chorus 99, a once thriving industrial center that had produced the Empire's finest capital ships. The footage, taken from the helmet cams of elite Dominion guards in their final moments, showed human soldiers moving with impossible speed and coordination. "They're soldiers." Kresh's voice broke entirely. He took a shuddering breath, blood now flowing freely from his nostrils. Medical protocols demanded immediate attention, but none would interrupt this critical briefing. The reports from Chorus 99 suggest they've modified themselves beyond recognition of their original form. Their exosuits aren't technology they wear, they're integrated into their bodies. They feel no pain, they show no mercy. The recording showed a human warrior, taking multiple direct hits from Dominion plasma weapons, strikes that should have vaporized any living tissue, yet continuing forward without hesitation. The soldier's chest cavity opened to reveal not organs but weapons systems that returned fire with devastating precision. In the background, other humans moved in perfect synchronization, as if controlled by a single mind. Most disturbing was the footage of captured Dominion officers being systematically connected to what appeared to be memory transfer devices. Their screams as human genetic memories were forcibly implanted into their consciousness had been mercifully muted, but their contorted faces told a story of agony beyond comprehension. "They're making our people experience their genocide," whispered Defense Minister Zatex, her ceremonial armor hanging loose on a frame that had lost alarming weight since the conflict began. Not just telling them about it, making them live it. The chamber fell silent as the weight of this revelation settled upon the gathered leadership. The Dominion had always prided itself on maintaining the purity of form that their ancestors had established as sacred. The idea of such fundamental self-transformation was anathema to their very cultural foundation. That humans had willingly sacrificed their physical purity for revenge spoke of a determination that terrified even the Empire's most hardened warriors. "The modifications aren't limited to their military," reported Science Director Verick, his voice quavering. "Intercepted communications suggest their entire species has undergone radical evolution. They've rewritten their genetic code, integrated machine consciousness," and he faltered, mandibles clicking in distress. "They've preserved the actual consciousness fragments of those who died in the original purge. When they say humanity remembers, it isn't metaphorical. The dead literally live on through them, driving their vengeance." Bacos slumped into his ancestral throne, feeling the weight of 1,000 years of imperial legacy crushing down upon him. The ornate seat, designed to project power and confidence, now seemed like a tomb closing around him. The air in the chamber grew thick with the stench of fear, a pheromonal response his species had evolved to signal imminent tribal danger, not experienced at this intensity since their primitive days. "What do they want?" Bacos finally asked, his voice barely audible, stripped of all imperial African. "Why not seek diplomacy? Resources? Territory? All empires want something tangible. What drives them to such lengths?" The answer came not from his advisors but from the communication system that suddenly flared to life, bypassing every security protocol as if they didn't exist. The emergency backup systems, the quantum encryption, the physical isolation safeties, all rendered meaningless in an instant. On the virtual display appeared the face of Admiral Jack Harper, his eyes reflecting the cold void of space itself. The human's appearance sent shockwaves through the chamber. His face bore the scars of combat, but it was the medications that horrified the Dominion leadership. Neural interfaces protruded from his temples, pulsing with data flows. His eyes were clearly artificial, focusing with mechanical precision. Most disturbing was the calm certainty in his expression, not the wild rage of a barbarian, but the cold, calculated determination of an executioner. "What we want, Chancellor Bacos, descendant of our executioner, is justice." The chamber erupted in chaos as security personnel rushed to disable the breach, their actions growing increasingly frantic as system after system failed to respond. Harper's voice continued, cutting through the panic like a blade. "We studied your history while you forgot ours. We know that your ancestor authorized the genocide of humanity because he feared what we might become. He saw in us a reflection of your own empire's brutality, but with one crucial difference: our capacity to evolve beyond our limitations." Bacos found himself unable to look away from those artificial eyes that seemed to pierce through the vast distance of space, to judge him personally. They were not the eyes of a being seeking conquest or plunder. They were the eyes of something that had evolved beyond such primitive desires into something far more terrifying, a force of cosmic retribution. "For 300 years we have lived with the memory of our burning worlds. For 300 years we have transformed our pain into purpose. Every child born in exile was engineered, not just to survive, but to become an instrument of reckoning. Every technological advancement was measured by a single standard. Will this bring us closer to justice? We have become exactly what your ancestor feared, a species that has transcended its original design, fueled by the memory of unspeakable loss." Behind Harper, holographic projections appeared showing human worlds burning, children disintegrating in plasma fire, entire continents cracking apart under bombardment. The images weren't historical recordings, they were the actual memories of the dead, preserved and experienced by every living human in a constant communion with atrocity. Harper's next words chilled the blood of every Dominion official present. "We don't want your territory. We don't want your resources. We want your complete and utter understanding of what it means to face extinction. Only then will justice be served." The transmission cut, leaving the chamber in stunned silence broken only by the sound of a junior officer collapsing in terror. In that moment, Varkos knew with terrible certainty that the Dominion, his legacy, his birthright, the empire that had stood unchallenged for a millennium, was facing not merely defeat, but judgment. On the fortified moon of Thanatos, Commander Xavier led the assault on the critical shipyard that had produced the very dreadnoughts that had once burned human worlds. Blood misted the air around him, some of it his enemies', some his own from wounds that his combat systems catalogued, but did not permit him to feel. His squad moved with inhuman synchronicity, their modified bodies processing battlefield information at speeds no unaltered species could match. The neural feed showed him Dominion forces retreating to a final defensive position around the main reactor complex. Xavier felt not just his own determination but the shared will of his strike team, their minds partially merged in battle meld. More profound was the chorus of the dead singing through his consciousness, the preserved memory echoes of those who had perished in the original purge. Among them was his own ancestral lineage, the ghostly presence of Eliza Xavier, his genetic forebearer, who had watched her children burn on Alpha Centauri III. Her anguish fueled his movements, her memories guiding his tactical decisions. In moments of perfect synchronicity, he could almost feel himself becoming her, the boundaries between present and past, living and dead, individual and collective, blurring into meaninglessness. "For Earth," he whispered, as he plunged his blade into the chest of a Dominion elite guard, the ceremonial armor parting like paper before molecularly sharpened edges. The neural interface embedded in his cerebral cortex broadcast the sentiment to every member of his strike team, who echoed it back in a symphony of shared consciousness, for Earth, for the dead, for justice. The guard's death scream merged with 1,000 others in Xavier's augmented hearing, a requiem for an empire that had believed itself eternal. As the body slumped to the ground, Xavier accessed the guard's neural patterns through his blade's integrated scanner, downloading the being's final moments and adding them to the collective memory archive. Each human soldier carried within them not just the genetic memory of their people's suffering, but fragments of actual consciousness from those who had died in the genocide, preserved through technology the Dominion could not comprehend. Every kill was not just an act of war, but a ritual of remembrance for the dead who lived on through them, their thirst for justice finally being quenched in Dominion blood. As the last defenders fell and the shipyard's self-destruct systems were neutralized, Xavier stood amid the carnage, his team moving efficiently to secure the technology and intelligence that would fuel the next phase of humanity's vengeance. Through his neural link, he felt Admiral Harper's acknowledgement of their success, another piece removed from the board, another step closer to the heart of the Dominion. Yet, as victory after victory mounted, a troubling reality emerged among the human forces. The vengeance that had sustained them for centuries was consuming them, transforming them into a force as merciless as the empire they had sworn to punish. The line between justice and genocide had blurred, obscured by blood and the intoxicating rush of power that came with watching an empire fall. In the quiet moments between battles, when the neural links were dialed back to permit individual reflection, doubts began to surface. Some began to question whether justice and vengeance could truly be distinguished from one another after so much blood had been spilled, whether what they were becoming, what they had willingly transformed themselves into, was still recognizably human at all. Xavier felt these doubts, like phantom pain from a limb long since replaced with machinery. The question haunted him: if humanity had modified itself to the point where they no longer resembled what they once were, who exactly was being avenged? Was there still a connection to the species that had been nearly exterminated, or had they become something else entirely, something that might have terrified their original ancestors as much as it terrified the Dominion? Admiral Jack Harper faced this question alone in his quarters aboard the Prometheus, staring at the ancient data crystal containing the records of humanity's near extinction. The holographic projections surrounded him like ghosts, the faces of children, of families, of entire civilizations reduced to ash. They stared back at him with eyes that demanded remembrance, demanded justice, demanded blood. He had given them two of those things in abundance. The third flowed like rivers across the stars, as human forces systematically dismantled the Dominion piece by bloody piece. Harper's neural interfaces pulsed with incoming tactical data, even in this rare moment of solitude. 37 Dominion wardens now lay in ruins. 17 shipyards had been destroyed or captured. The once mighty Imperial fleets were reduced to scattered battle groups, fighting desperate holding actions as human forces advanced inexorably toward the core systems. The physical toll of the campaign showed on Harper's body: new scars, new modifications, new parts replacing those lost in battle. His left arm below the elbow was entirely synthetic now, lost during the assault on Kerith's Prime. The doctors had offered to clone a natural replacement, but Harper had opted for the combat model instead. It seemed fitting somehow, another piece of his humanity sacrificed on the altar of vengeance. But another voice had begun to whisper from the shadows of his consciousness, a voice questioning whether humanity's return from the brink of extinction was merely to become the very monster they had sworn to defeat. It came not from his neural implants or the collective battle meld, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere more fundamentally human than all their modifications had managed to erase. The voice asked questions he had no answers for. What would remain of humanity after vengeance was complete? What would they build on the ashes of the Dominion? Could beings so thoroughly engineered for retribution ever find peace, or would they simply seek new targets for their wrath? Most haunting was the question that came to him in the brief moments of natural sleep his modified physiology still required. Would the original victims of the Dominion's genocide, the true humans, unmodified and unaltered, even recognize what their descendants had become? Harper raised his mechanical hand to touch the projection of a young girl, her face frozen in terror as her world whirled around her. The hologram flickered through his fingers, insubstantial, untouchable, a ghost he could never truly reach across the gulf of centuries. "Are we still fighting for you?" he whispered to the void. "Or have we become something you would fear as much as those who destroyed you?" The only answer was the steady pulse of his artificial heart, beating the rhythm of a war that threatened to consume not just the Dominion, but whatever remained of humanity's soul. The stars held no answers for Admiral Jack Harper as he stood at the helm of the Prometheus, his gaze fixed on the swirling crimson nebula that marked the edge of what was once human territory. The weight of his mission pressed against his chest like a physical force. He commanded not just a warship, but the vanguard of humanity's return from the shadows of near extinction. His weathered face, carved with lines of suffering and resolve, reflected the cold light of distant suns that had once warmed human worlds. The bridge hummed with tension, the air itself seeming to vibrate with the collective anticipation of revenge 3 centuries in the making. Harper's augmented heart, a mechanical necessity after the genetic modifications that had kept their lineage alive, beat with unnatural precision beneath his scarred chest. He had been born for this moment, engineered for this purpose, the culmination of generations of planning. "They called us myths," he whispered, fingers trailing across the ancient data crystal in his palm, the only surviving record of the genocide that had driven humanity to the far reaches of uncharted space. The crystal's surface was worn smooth from countless hands that had held it in reverence, a sacred relic from a lost civilization. "They erased us from history, murdered billions, and then forgot we ever existed." The crystal pulsed with a faint blue glow as it activated at his touch, projecting hauntingly vivid holograms into the dimly lit bridge. Fragmented records salvaged from the ruins of Earth materialized images of human colonies burning, their atmosphere igniting like paper in a furnace, of children screaming as they watched their parents disintegrate under Dominion weapons fire, of once verdant worlds reduced to molten rock and toxic ash. Most haunting was the final recording, the face of Supreme Chancellor Vikos I, his 6 eyes cold with clinical detachment as he delivered the order that had condemned humanity to what they believed was extinction. "Leave no trace of their existence. The species is too dangerous to be remembered. Purge all records. Sterilize all worlds. Hunt the survivors to extinction. Let the universe forget they ever drew breath." Harper closed his eyes against the images, but they continued to play across his consciousness, embedded not just in his memory but in his very DNA. Every human alive now carried these memories, a genetic archive of atrocity that could never be forgotten or forgiven. The result of generations born and raised in the crushing darkness of deep space, their bodies and minds altered to survive the void and remember their purpose. Behind him, Commander Xavier stood in respectful silence, his scarred face reflecting the red glow of the tactical display. Where his left eye should have been was a cybernetic implant that constantly fed tactical information directly into his brain. The right side of his face was a roadmap of suffering, burn tissue from an early encounter with a Dominion patrol, when their exile fleet had nearly been discovered. "The Dominion dreadnought has altered course," Xavier announced, his voice carrying the artificial undertone of someone who had replaced his vocal cords with synthetic alternatives after surviving a Dominion interrogation chamber decades earlier. The memory of those torture sessions was shared among the crew through their neural links, a warning and a reminder. "They've detected us, but classify us as primitive. Their transmission calls us space debris. Not worthy of a full battle group, they're sending a single vessel to investigate." A harsh laugh escaped from Lieutenant Kara, the weapons officer whose fingers were literally fused with her console, a voluntary modification that allowed microsecond reaction times. "They've forgotten what we look like," she said, bitterness saturating every syllable. "They've forgotten to fear us." Harper closed his fingers around the crystal until his knuckles whitened, the edges cutting into his palm. A drop of blood trickled between his fingers, but he welcomed the pain, a small echo of what his ancestors had endured. "They will remember us today." His eyes found the faces of his bridge crew, each of them descendants of the handful of survivors who had fled beyond known space 3 centuries ago. Some bore obvious modifications: enhanced musculature, reinforced skeletal structures, neural interfaces glinting at their temples. Others carried their evolution internally: enhanced organs, improved cognitive functions, genetically encoded battle reflexes. Their ancestors had pledged a blood oath that their children would return not to rebuild, but to execute judgment upon those who had tried to erase humanity from existence. That oath was written not just in historical records, but in their modified DNA. Every cell in their bodies cried out for justice. Every breath they took was in defiance of the extinction that had been decreed for their kind. "Open the neural link," Harper commanded, and instantly felt the minds of his crew merge partially with his own. Not a complete loss of individuality, but a battle meld that allowed instantaneous communication and coordination. Through the link, he felt their hunger for vengeance, their terror that they might fail, their resolve to succeed or die in the attempt. He let his own certainty flow through the connection, steadying their collective consciousness. "All ships, battle formations," he ordered, his voice eerily calm while the neural link carried the full depth of his emotional state to his crew and fleet. "Remember the oath of our ancestors. Remember Earth. Remember the billions screaming in fire. Remember the children who never drew a second breath. Remember the worlds that will never bloom again." Through the view screen, the approaching Dominion dreadnought grew larger, a behemoth of arrogance and complacency. It was easily 5 times the size of the Prometheus, its hull adorned with the trophies of 1,000 conquered species. Harper could feel the contempt emanating from it, the casual dismissal of what they perceived as inferior life forms. The human fleet moved with uncanny precision, their ships executing maneuvers that defied conventional tactics. Where the Dominion relied on brute force and overwhelming firepower, humanity had developed stealth, speed, and synchronicity. They had spent 300 years preparing for this moment, developing technologies and strategies the Dominion could never anticipate. "They're hailing us," Communications Officer Lin reported, her voice tinged with disgust. "They're ordering us to identify ourselves and prepare for boarding and inspection." Harper straightened his back, feeling the weight of history upon his shoulders. "Show them who we are. Activate primary weapons systems. Target their propulsion and communication arrays first. We want them disabled, not destroyed. They must live long enough to warn the others." When the first salvo tore through the Dominion dreadnought's shields as if they were gossamer, the bridge erupted in savage cheers. Harper remained stoic, watching as confusion turned to panic aboard the enemy vessel. Their return fire was pathetically inaccurate, a testament to how soft they had become in the absence of worthy adversaries. Only when the dreadnought listed helplessly in space, its engines dark and its weapons systems shattered, did Admiral Harper allow himself a single tear, the only emotion he would permit himself to display. It traced a path down his weathered cheek, carrying with it the grief of countless lost generations. "Send the message across all Dominion frequencies," he commanded, his voice thick with emotion he could no longer fully suppress. "Make sure it bypasses every security protocol. I want it playing in their nurseries and their throne rooms. I want it haunting their dreams." Lieutenant Lin nodded, her fingers dancing across her console. "Transmission ready, Admiral. All Dominion frequencies open." Harper took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 3 centuries of exile, of planning, of suffering, of evolution funneled into this single moment. When he spoke, his voice carried not just his own authority, but the collective will of a species that had refused to accept extinction. Attention, Dominion of Raal, you erased us from your histories, you purged our records from your archives, you turned our worlds to ash and called us extinct. But humanity remembers, we have returned, and we have come to collect a debt written in the blood of billions. The message echoed across the void, breaking through encryptions and firewalls as if they weren't there, reaching every Dominion vessel, command center, and colony within range. On the crippled dreadnought floating before them, Harper could almost feel the wave of recognition and terror sweeping through the crew as they finally understood what they faced. "Prepare boarding parties," Harper ordered, his gaze fixed on the helpless enemy vessel. "I want survivors. I want witnesses. When they limp home to their masters, I want them carrying our message in their nightmare." As the assault shuttles launched toward the crippled dreadnought, Harper turned to Xavier, his expression set in grim determination. "Today we are only a ghost story. By the time we reach Vahal Prime, we will be their apocalypse." The stars that had witnessed humanity's near extinction now bore witness to the beginning of their retribution, a reckoning 3 centuries in the making, written in fire and blood across the canvas of space.